Welcome back to Grumpy Vet Garage. The engine that comes in turbo model 2G DSMs and late first gen DSMs is the 7-bolt 4G63. The 4G63 is a 2.0 engine, cast iron construction, very capable as far as building and making power. Also, the head that comes on the 4G63 is a double overhead cam head that flows very well. To achieve serious power levels with a 4G63, an upgrade is required. There's a limited amount of time that you can make power north of 300 to 400 horsepower on a stock engine. So there's many different options that you have when building a 4G series motor. You don't have to just build a 2.0 forged bottom end engine to make serious power. You have other options. This engine here is actually a 4G64 block that I pulled out of a Eclipse Spider. The biggest, most immediate difference that you'll see between the 4G64 and the 4G63 is a 6mm higher deck height. Try to get you a good side by side so you can see where the stud is and this relief, how much higher it is. And then on the 4G63, here's the stud and there's the deck height. So that is the deck height difference. So with the deck height difference of the 4G64, there actually is a stroke difference in this engine. The crank in this engine is a 100mm crank, and in the 4G63, the 2.0, it is an 88mm crank. Also, it'll be hard to really show with the naked eye. You'd have to measure it. There is a bore difference as well. So the bore on the 4G63 2.0 is an 85mm bore, and on the 4G64, it is an 86.5mm bore. Now, at the beginning, I talked about the head that comes on the 4G63, and it's a great head, and really the only head for this engine. You need to put that on the 4G64 to make any serious power. The 4G64 heads are not what you're going to want to build with. You're going to want to do a 4G63 head on a 4G64 block if that's the route you decided to take. The turbo 4G63, it has oil squirters to cool down pistons. And the 4G64 does not have that. Some people build engines, make a ton of power, and don't even use oil squirters. But the turbo 4G63 has it, and the 4G64 does not have it. Another big difference, and something you'll have to address, because if you're going to build this engine, you want to put a 4G63 head on it, a double overhead cam turbo head. But when you look at the deck on the top of the 4G63, you see there's nothing here. When you come over to the 4G64, there are additional oil drain back holes on the block. It's not that big a deal, but if you don't plug those, the head will not cover those holes completely. So what ends up happening is you need to plug these holes using either a threaded plug or a freeze plug sealed in to prevent any kind of crankcase vapor from being expelled through these holes, because it'll be exposed. Also, anything getting down into the crankcase. One thing that is the same between the two blocks is the rods. The rods are both 150mm, whether it's the 2.0 4G63 or the 2.4 liter 4G64. So rods and pistons are removed from both the 4G64 and the 4G63. And I want to just have you look at the crankshaft here. So look at the reference between the end of the main journal here and the rod journal. See that offset? Now we're going to come over here to the 4G63 main journal and then the offset. It's kind of hard to see it right there. But again, it's 6mm, which in the total stroke makes up the 12mm, or roughly half an inch of stroke difference between these two engines. So this is the 4G63 piston and rod, and this is the 4G64 piston and rod. They are identical. They are 150mm. There's no difference between these two engines' rods. You do see different casting marks. I can't tell if one would be stronger, but the pistons look very similar, except for the crowns. The crowns are different. And the rods are the same length. So essentially, one other thing that I, was hoping to maybe be able to see is there is actually different thrust bearings. You see the side bearings there on this 4G64? They are not connected to the main right there. So there's two separate thrust washers that stop in play on this particular 4G64. On the 4G63, which not all of them, again, I'm not trying to say that these engines have this or don't have this. This is just two different designs from early and late model, and I don't know what years, but this is a one-piece thrust washer design. So the main and the thrust washer are all one piece. On the 4G64 that had the multi-piece thrust washer, here's a center main, which is honestly probably just the same as all the other mains, and then the side load washers. And then here is the one-piece unit that was in the other block. Which one is better? I'm actually not quite sure, but I don't think that's something to stress over. Again, if I'm missing the point on that, let me know in the comments. Now I have the cranks and the main bearings removed, and here is the 4G64, and you can see the main bearing here. And then on the 4G63, you can see there's a difference. This is the oil squirter. It's right here, and it protrudes underneath this area to spray at the back of the piston. Okay, now that we've gone over all of that, I kind of want to go over a few basic concepts that apply to 4G series engines when you're building them. And in some cases, they apply to other types of engines, but right now I'm kind of just focusing on 4G series motors. The first thing is more displacement is going to help you spool a turbo faster. You run a bigger turbo, the spool time on a larger displacement engine is going to be faster than a smaller displacement engine, whether it's built or not built. Also, generally, that larger displacement is going to give you more power across the power band. Increasing displacement on these engines, which you may want to do, really the only significant way to do it is going to be through stroke. Increasing the stroke is going to increase the displacement of the engine. Increasing bore to get more displacement is not really going to be all that effective. The engine is cast iron construction, and there is some rather inconsistent bore thicknesses in 4G series blocks. It's well documented. A lot of people in Australia, for instance, that are building Evo 3s, I've noticed that, not all blocks are thick as other blocks in the same place. So in general, saying like, I'm going to bore out this cylinder and make a bigger engine that way, it's not really the best way to really do it. Also, another concept is increasing the stroke is going to increase piston speed, which is going to also affect your redline capability. How high can you rev the engine? This is going to be very highlighted when it comes to balancing an assembly. Anytime you stroke an engine, balance becomes even more critical than it already was. So any of the small vibrations that you may see are increased with the stroke, and that's why trying to rev a larger stroke engine as much as a shorter stroke engine is just not physically possible, at least not for a long period of time. So increasing rod length and decreasing stroke length is going to give you a higher rod to stroke ratio. And with this number, there's math in this video, that type of engine has a higher capability of revving higher. So in this next section of the video, I want to go over that there are more than just a 2.0 block and a 2.4 liter block that you can build. With the two engines between the 4G63 and the 4G64 block, the factory size cranks plus a custom size crank, which in this case, 88 millimeters of 2.0, 94 millimeter is a custom crank that is available, and a 100 millimeter crank, which is the size of the 4G64, you can use those three to make other configurations. I don't want this to be too number saturated, me just giving you numbers. I'm going to put them on the screen so you can see. So 2 blocks, 3 combinations of crank sizes. Granted, you could use the factory crank, but an aftermarket crank would be better. A forged crank's what you're going to really want. And then additionally, there's 3 different rod sizes. I do not recommend you using a factory rod to build an engine. If you've pulled out that factory rod, tell it thank you for its service and send it on its way, get you a forged rod. And then pistons, there are actually 4 different combinations of pistons, and it's all about the height of the piston from the wrist pin of the piston. So the factory piston is a 1.375 to the top of the piston, and then there are ones that are shorter that are sometimes considered stroker pistons. But with the combination of 4 pistons, 3 different rods, 3 different cranks, and then 2 different blocks, there are a lot of combinations. With just the 4G63 block, you have 5 different engine building combinations that you can do. With the 4G64, you have 6 different configurations. I'm going to go ahead and list them out real quick, but I'm going to highlight some that I think are a little different and maybe a little more to the application that you may want to use the engine for. So utilizing the 4G63 block, you can build a 2.0 standard, which is what it was, a 2.0 long rod, a 2.1 liter stroker, a 2.1 long rod stroker, and then a 2.3 stroker. The 2.3 stroker is the build that I chose for my 2G DSM, and I think it's a good option, and I'll tell you why later, but it's not good for all purposes. Now, utilizing the 4G64 block, you can build a 2.4 liter standard, which is what it comes from, that same configuration, a 2.4 long rod, a 2.2 destroker, a 2.2 long rod destroker, a 2.1 destroker, and then a 2.1 long rod destroker. I'm going to highlight that it does exist, and I don't really know why you would necessarily want to do it, but there is such a thing as a 2.6 liter stroker 4G64. It's custom crank, rod, pistons. I believe you have to clearance the bottom of the block for the swing, but I'm not really going to get into that. I don't think it's the best option, really. It is the most displacement, but we're talking about a very long stroke motor, so we're not even talking about that. So 2.6 stroker, it exists, but we're not talking about that. Okay, now I'm going to go over each engine individually. I'm not going to read every single stat and dimension. I'll put them up on the screen so you can see them. I want to go ahead and just say every single combination I'm saying here will be fine for a street engine. They're all going to be good for street use, so there's no like, oh, that don't want to use that one on the street. With the properly sized turbo, all of these will be fun to drive. So starting with the 2.0, the standard 4G63, again, good engine, capable, if built properly, could rev up as high as maybe 10,000 RPM, but the key thing is the rod to stroke ratio on this one is a 1.70. Now the 2.0 long rod. What this is a longer rod with the wrist pin higher in the piston, but the stroke is the same. So with the 2.0 long rod, you get a very rev happy engine with a rod to stroke ratio of 1.77. So this could be an engine that really could be a good racing application engine. It's going to like RPM. If you can get the large turbo spool capable of making big power and not beating itself up. Another thing I really didn't mention, a stroker engine that has a very low rod to stroke ratio is going to wear the engine more. Now, is my 2.3, and I want to get to that, is my 2.3 stroker going to beat itself up after 2 years? No. If it was used in the same environment, would it last as long as a 2.0? Probably not. I built it well, and it should last for a long time, but just inherently more stroke and an increased piston, an increased rod angle tends to lead to increased engine wear as a general statement. The 2.1 stroker, this particular one, has a rod to stroke ratio of 1.59, so not as good as the 2.0 factory, but it is an increased displacement, so it's going to have a better time spooling a bigger turbo. On the street, it's going to spool a turbo quicker, it's going to have a little more power, driving around than a 2.0 would, and this is also a pretty good for maybe road racing, but again, for drag racing, probably not the best application. The 2.1 long rod, again, the 2.1, so it's an increased displacement over the 2.0. The rod to stroke ratio is 1.65, so a little closer to what the 2.0 rod to stroke ratio is. So this one can rev pretty good and could be good for racing applications, maybe even drag racing applications. And then lastly, on the 4G63 blocks, there is a 2.3 stroker. This is what I built. This is much more displacement, 0.3 liter. And again, this helps spool turbo, which is fun on the street. It has a wider torque curve and power band than the 2.0. I think the sweet spot for this is a good street engine that could use some road racing or autocross where you're not really sustaining high RPM for a long period of time. This engine is very capable of doing that. It's not going to rev to the moon. I would say probably 8,000 RPM when built properly would be the max that you would want to go. So if you're looking to a rev monster, this isn't it. But as far as torque delivery, this one is a torquier engine than what the smaller displacement engines would be, which is why it's perfect for a street car and why I got it. Forgot to mention the rod to stroke ratio on a 2.3 is 1.50. So as you can see with that number, it's not conducive to high RPM. Moving on to 4G64 based engines, starting with the 2.4 liter standard, what it comes with. That particular engine in the factory configuration has a stroke ratio of 1.5, just like a 2.3 stroker. So if you have the capability of getting the 6.4, the 4G64, it has the same rod to stroke ratio as a 2.3 stroker, but you have more displacement. So in theory, it would be more capable. Granted, no oil squirters. But again, this would be a good engine, I believe, for street applications, maybe not competition racing, especially anything that's going to require high RPMs at extended period of time. Then there is the 2.4 long rod. That particular engine has a rod to stroke ratio of 1.56, so better than that of the 2.3 or the 2.4 in its factory configuration. Get it a little bit more RPM, but again, it's still in the same ballpark and it's still 2.4 liter. Now getting into D-stroker configurations. There's the 2.2 D-stroker with the 4G64 block. This one has a rod to stroke of 1.65, so it's capable of turning some pretty decent RPM, probably not close to 10,000, but maybe 9,500. But it's got an increased stroke over a 2.0, but you're just taking some of the, or increased displacement over the 2.0, but you're taking out some of the issues revving that you would have with a long stroke engine. Then there's the 2.2 long rod D-stroker. Again, you're still getting some displacement, but that particular rod to stroke ratio is 1.72. So better than that of a standard 2.0 block. This one gives you more displacement, spool turbo a little quicker. This one could be used for drag racing, road racing applications. It's a good combination. Then there's the 2.1 D-stroker using the 4G64, an even better rod to stroke combination of 1.77. Again, just an increased amount of RPM capability. Still a little bit more displacement than the 2.0, but not as good as 2.3 or 2.4. And then the last combination I want to talk about is the 2.1 long rod D-stroker with the 4G64. This one has a rod to stroke ratio of 1.84. These engines can be revved as high as 11,000 RPM. You would need to find out what application that would suit you, but this, to me, drag racing application, spooling a big turbo, in that type of configuration would be good. Maybe not road racing, or maybe road racing, but this one is a rev-happy combination. And again, with the stats on the screen, you can see it requires custom piston, custom rod length, but it still uses a factory stroke 4G63 size crank. So I know that was very information, technical data heavy section of the video, but what are my recommendations? My recommendations are, if oil squirters are important to you, I would start with a 4G63 based engine. If it's not that big a deal to you, the 4G64 offers some really good long rod configurations to turn some RPM, or just to build a 2.4 liter that's going to give you torque on the street. I like the 2.3 stroker for a street car. I think it's a great car to have, a great engine combination, I should say, to have. If I was building a race engine, I probably would still take the insurance of having the oil squirters and go for a 2.0 long rod motor. Rev a lot of RPM. You know, you can get the turbo spooled at the line, an all-wheel drive launch with a large turbo and an engine that will rev to maybe close to 11,000 RPM. Maybe sounds like a pretty amazing combination. With that being said, the 4G64 and a 2.1 long rod destroker is also a combination that can do that exact same thing. A little more displacement, a lot of RPM. So you have to ask yourself, am I racing or am I driving it on the street? If I'm driving it on the street, get you a 2.3 would be the probably easiest way to get a good stroker package in your 2G DSM. Granted, remembering you're gonna buy forged pistons. If you're not buying forged pistons, I'm not sure why you're trying to make any kind of large power. Forged rods, you're gonna need increased rods. The factory rods are not gonna hold up to that load. Also, the factory crank. There are a lot of treatments you can get: cryo treating, knife edging, balancing. You can try that route, and a lot of people have had good success with it. But for the money, it's actually not that expensive to get yourself a good forged rotating assembly and just have your factory 4G63 block milled to accept upgraded parts and build exactly what you want. So I don't want you to look at these different combinations of crank and rod and piston and think, well, that's too unattainable. If you think it is, don't build the engine. Just keep it stock power levels, maybe a little upgrade on the turbo, and enjoy the car. But if you're going to build the engine, you're not just stuck with a 2.0. You have a lot of options, and you can turn around and decide what works good for your particular application. But if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to Grumpy Vet Garage, liking this video, sharing this video to other people you know that's got 2G DSMs or other Mitsubishi products. Also, we have a Grumpy Vet Garage merch store. This is a Grumpy Vet Garage shirt here. It's actually got a graphic on the back. A link to that store is in the description below. Go on there and get something for yourself. It really helps out the channel to grow. But again, thanks for coming and seeing me in my garage. And until next time, have a good one.